Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Welcome back to Socializing Security, everybody. Brian here by myself to kind of kick off this episode. Mila will join me along with our guest here in a little bit. So that brings us to today's topic, which is to talk a little bit about data management within a healthcare setting. And to have that conversation, we were joined by Patrick Kovalik, who is an industry principal for healthcare and life sciences at Snowflake. So obviously very focused around the data side of things at being at Snowflake. But Patrick has had a long history with the healthcare side of things in multitude of different perspectives. So having worked for kind of payer, if you will, like the health insurance side of things, working with a lot of hospitals and in the provider side of things, been in the trenches, been in management, been in data analytics. He's kind of seen that industry from all sorts of directions. We were able to meet up with him, or Milu was able to meet up with him at HIPAA earlier this year. And we finally got him to join us for a podcast episode. So let's go ahead and bring on Patrick and Milu, and we'll have a great conversation about the data and protecting data within the life sciences and healthcare environment. And we're back with Patrick. Patrick, why don't you give kind of your real quick intro and let people hear your voice?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Hi, guys. Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick Kovalik. I am an industry principal for the healthcare life sciences practice at Snowflake. Just quick background on me. My whole life has been in data analytics on the business side. I've been in the payer sector for 10 years, a dozen years before I found Snowflake. But that's kind of what I bring to the table. Is everything I always did, whether it was executive leadership, was always driven through data. So, and then now being in healthcare, that's kind of how we all crossed paths. What's the intersection of healthcare quality and healthcare value with data protection and analytics. So great to connect. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, I bet too in the healthcare industry, a lot of the data management, I'm hoping it's not a super new concept, right? I think healthcare has been one of the most regulated industries for the longest time when it comes to data and what they have access to. So I'm sure what your team is working on at the moment is very important to a lot of the practitioners that you guys are dealing with on a regular basis.
I mean, 100%. I mean, I hope that, again, like for folks that are on that aren't healthcare, again, the concept of data protection is not a nice to have. It is like beyond whatever's higher than table stakes. That's healthcare data management. You have to have the ability to make sure that it's managed, it's usable, but at all stages of how you are using it, that it's protected, and only the people that need access can get it, and et cetera. So 100%, most healthcare people who live in here will always say they've been joined at the hip to their compliance department, because if not, you learn the hard way. It's table stakes. So yeah, great foundation. Anybody in healthcare, there is a data strategy and data protection, and then there's kind of healthcare data protection. It's pretty important.
Yeah, and we're definitely hoping to dive into that today, given your expertise. So could you kind of just walk us through, when you think about data strategy, what does that mean to you? And how do you kind of explain that to somebody who's maybe never heard that term before?
Sure. I mean, it clearly, loaded topic, a lot of ways you can go on this, but, at its core, the data strategy is, how does an organization, collect, manage, share, use all their data? I think when I get into those conversations, it's definitely not just a technology answer. It's truly the alignment of, your people, your processes, the systems you have, and with that comes different core pillars. How do you apply data governance, classification, accessibility, the life cycle of your data, the quality of your data. I mean, especially in healthcare, there's a concept that, folks that have been in this industry forever is, a healthcare data set never has an end state. Like the data is living. a claim, even once it's adjudicated, still could continually be adjusted, corrected, resubmitted. Brian, your medical record, I mean, my goodness, it doesn't just end. Like, it is with you for your entire journey. So that is
Yeah.
kind of the fun and excitement of a data strategy in healthcare, is you have to account for it's never stable. So that's kind of, and then that leads into, with data strategy, when you get into with healthcare, it's, or even just modern data strategies overall for any industry, but you shift a lot from, if we would have done this podcast 20 years ago, is just, where are my data domains? Where am I getting my data from, and have it stored? Now you're getting into the evolution of, data products. How do you curate different data sets meant for the business? So they're already designed for business value, rather than just having somebody always have to stitch it together for either BI or an analytical workload. Because in the end, even though that could be saved as a custom SQL script or a dashboard, they're generated, kind of custom and ad hoc. And so the shift of having data domains and different layers of data and how you're going to use them, to getting into data products, because maybe then I'm going to shift them for data sharing, or for modern analytics, or especially for AI. And then I add in the fun of the semantic layer and all that. So, like, in the end, like, it's probably, you could have a whole podcast on just what does data strategy mean, but there you go. And that's kind of why it's so complicated, and why it's hard for, folks who don't really live in that space to understand, why is it so hard? Just, run me a report. And then in healthcare too, it's just, there's so much with interoperability and the different complexities and formats and size and speed that you need. It all, that is the fun.
Yeah, it's such a important tool for any business, their data. Most companies will say that is their differentiator, is the data that they have.
Yes.
I've been in the payer space as well, and that data is gold. The level of analytics 20 years ago when I was in that space was pretty amazing. I can only imagine what it is today.
Yeah.
But that data can also be a liability. And having all of that data makes you a rich target. It means that those types of things can potentially be weaponized. Like, any good tool can be used as a weapon type of a situation. How much does that play into that strategy for most customers?
It's especially in the vein of healthcare. I mean, that's kind of, reinforcing of why we take it for granted that is table stakes. There, you cannot risk getting in the news for how you manage your data, because you did hit on it. So you started with the validation of how valuable the data is in healthcare, and no argument. The ability to stitch together a person is how you try to figure out, how do I deliver better care, is at the point of care, and then with better quality. But guess what? Everybody is always watching, and healthcare is probably the most heavily regulated industry that we have. So when you have heavy regulations, you always have an audience that is trying to poke holes and try to find flaws and to put things on the map. And that is why, like, the context for any healthcare audience is, protect, protect, protect. And I think some of where you're also going to is sort of the, on one side of my shoulder is the excitement of this AI revolution. And then the other side is the absolute terror of, like, what are you going to do with AI that's on my data? Because now you're even generating data that might not even be mine. How do I know that it's mine? How do I get there? So, completely agree. And I think folks really just start to lean in and accelerate when they at least respect that never goes away, Brian. When you go through even an audit or a readiness and you pass, all that means is that's first wave. Like, great, you have the foundations, but business continuity, data audits, that is why organizations audit themselves so often, and other organizations audit. So anyway, like, to the folks that, just aren't used to healthcare, like, that is, at any given day, that is your mandate, your mission. You have business drivers, but, protect and govern, and, make sure that, you follow those compliance requirements. It's your life. So I agree on it. And it's important too, because it's also could be the difference of, not to try to get, too grandiose here, but I mean, you have a human at the center of the data. That is probably the difference. Is I'm not losing an order that I placed on a shopping cart, and I got sponges instead of the headphones that I wanted. I mean, if I match Brian Newston to Brian Newstrom, that could be the
Yep.
difference of you missing, like, like again, you're not, if you're coming in for just a physical, shoot, we screwed up. But I tell you what if you're coming in the ER and you're unconscious and you have, time is of the essence. So like that's a concept in healthcare, they call it like EMPIs or identity management. Like who is the master person record that when an organization gets 23 sources of data that is Brian, some are going to come in as B Knutson or Brian Knutson or even Brian with a Y because they had to spell it, So anyway, to the point of you both have to protect your data and also be strategic to innovate, but like always remember that a human is at the center, and whether that human is a physician or a patient, it's a human, and that's kind of why it's so critical. So if sometimes I smile at that because people are like, well, why is it so regulated? Like, it's funny, you forget, like sometimes when you're not in there. So it's a healthy reminder just to say, look, the reason we do all this is so that you have a better care experience and you can deal with the issue that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I think that is helpful with the healthcare industry because I think you can labor that point a little bit more than kind of what you said versus sponges versus, a charger or something like that. I do think it brings it closer to home, right? When individuals are like, hey, this is your data. And like everybody can imagine how bad that would be if, their personal health information was made public for whatever reason or disclosed. That could impact so much. So there's just more at risk and more at stake. I will say I'd be curious to hear your perspective too, because I feel like we hear a lot about data governance these days, and I feel like it's maybe moved a little bit away from data strategy. From my understanding, data strategy would be more of the holistic approach, considering all of the different elements from the data lifecycle, as opposed to really just what is governing and who's responsible for data management. Is that kind of the correct understanding?
I mean, to be candid, like I didn't mean to pick up on it, but like moving away from governance. I mean, we like let's dig in a little deeper there because I'm kind of curious where maybe either you've seen or if you've heard that from another industry. Because again, like to a guy kind of who's lived in healthcare pretty much his whole life, it never drifts away. It's just a different way of how to ensure that governance is there. Whether I'm using data lineage to kind of source where it came from, so I can see it step by step to the point that it was accessible. Or I can have, traceability and lineage to see what did Brian ask of this data? Or, he asked for your personal health record 4 times and I suppressed it. But after the 4th time, just curious, was he using the wrong ID or was there intent? So, governance and with protection, it's like I think the shift though is more of it is so complex, and especially with the technology stacks and the use cases that you have, like that's probably more why you see now like roles that are defined just for that, like a chief data officer different than a chief information officer, different than now even a chief AI officer and a chief or a VP of analytics and a data steward. And so in the end, I think like what you have is a much more kind of matrixed view of like, hey, you need to focus on this one ball and it's all part of one massive organizational strategy, but don't ever think that you've moved beyond that. And then especially too when you look at the shift of data from how it's collected at the point of capture in an application to then how it may migrate into a lake or into a warehouse, or especially both of them, and then as it's exposed into a BI layer or now an AI layer. I mean, like just off the top of our head, we just spitballed sort of like 5 different stages or layers of what is a data strategy. And you have to make sure that, if Brian goes in and at the application level, he can only see record A. But if he goes directly to the warehouse and he writes a query and now he can actually see record A plus B. And then what if he's in, a BI layer and he runs a dashboard? Now he sees A plus B plus C. And then in AI, he just goes, hey, tell me what patients we have. And guess what? The whole world comes to him. That is sort of the complexity of maybe like from a formal, if you're kind of saying the drift from governance, that is probably just a lexicon problem, because the governance then has actually been applied across all 3 layers and has to be unified to say, we don't care what entry point the data is sourced or what entry point the data is used. We need to ensure that at all times it has been protected and only the people who need to see the info is there. And, to be candid too, some of even governance has evolved into give me a better way to try to like not have to watch all this. So that's why now you see such heavy focus on data protection policies and access controls, but also tokenization of the entire enterprise data or even synthesizing data. The ability that, if I needed to give Brian one of the data sets for one of the health plans that I work with or a hospital system, to give him like clinical data that has your PHI on it because I want him to build me a model, holy smokes, that should give anybody listening to this heartburn. So what I could do now is I could synthesize a data set. I could completely anonymize, or I could, mask it, and I could just go, hey, you have at it. Here is 10 million records, enough volume that you can prove to me performance and the model will work. But I've given you 0 for PHI and PII. That is a lot of where the shift of governance is even just saying, hey, you build your model and then come back and then we'll reapply it. So anyway, not, kind of every question I'm sure that we'll talk about has a number of different answers, but I think the shift of governance is actually much broader in today's data economy than it even was, decades ago, because it used to just sort of be at the data warehouse. And now it is at every layer, from transaction capture to ingestion to, to sharing and interop and BI, et cetera.
I really like that the concept of synthesized data or anonymizing the data, things like that, because way early in my career, started as a developer, did a lot of database work because
Yeah,
it was just
cool.
necessary. And yeah, that was a common thing. We just, okay, production database, drag and drop it over into development. Didn't matter what was in it. I want to work on live data because I want to know it's going to work with the live data.
Yeah.
And that's, that's pre-HIPAA days. So
Yeah.
it was unregulated wild, wild west. And those types of things really make me think, because I actively did those things. And when I learn about these technologies of tokenization and synthetic data, really speak to me from that perspective. And I think those are huge pieces that honestly I don't think get talked about enough. So I guess, how common are those in the particularly in the healthcare industry, since that's what to hey, I'm a developer, I want to work on lifelike data.
Yeah.
How commonly do those get utilized these days?
I mean, it's very common, either from a discussion or even entire subsegments that now that is all they do. And so that then that's, you have a vendor or a business associate that is what they're chartered with. But the same way, Brian, that you even just caught a little bit of a smile and you're like, man, I haven't heard about this in a bit. Or like, I remember what it looked like for me X years ago and imagine what I could do today. That's why it should be talked about a little bit more. I mean, when you spend months to develop a dashboard or an algorithm to predict something for care coordination or, quality control, and you're doing it on, like, I'm air quoting if I'm, for just audio listeners, dev data, and all of a sudden then you go and show it and you're so proud, Brian, when you built that model and you go, like, you probably had to say something like, hey, don't pay attention to the data, pay attention to how it works or maybe how it presents, like, disregard the fact that I'm using Donald Duck. And guess what? You lose your audience, or if you show it with dev data and a medical director goes, well, what the heck? Patrick passed away 2 months ago. Why are you showing me his record? Like, you just lose the whole audience of, like I told you, don't pay attention to the data, like, or, what's the Wizard of Oz? Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. I want you to help me test the model. So I did it too as a former developer, analyst, leading analytical teams. Like, you have to find ways to present like data that makes sense to get business buy-in. But if I present production data in a development world, I mean, my gosh, the risk factor goes up incredibly. So with modern technologies, or I'm fortunate enough to work at one of those cloud-based platforms that, you could snap a finger and take, what's called a clone of your data. And it doesn't create a new copy. It doesn't move the data. It just lets you leverage, that day's eligibility, that day's patient data, that day's claims. And then boom, I could synthesize, or pardon me, I could anonymize, I could protect, I could, differentiate the access to that. And then to either myself or a development team, you could be building on what is, much more secured production type data. So then when I show it to a business team and try to get buy-in or actual, how are you going to use this? They're not lost in the, like, it's hard for me to relate to who Donald Duck is. He's, is he, what's his gender? What's his risk factor? And you're like, oh, shoot. Okay. Let me go back to the drawing board. So anyway, Brad, completely relate. I think anybody who listens to this stuff, if you've ever been a developer, the drama of, or even just performance, hey, you build a model on 10 records and somebody goes, okay, we have 10 million members in our population. What's it going to run like? And then you apply it on that. and you're like, shoot, I need another week. I got to figure out why this isn't coming back. So yes, I think like, is it popular? I mean, 100%. Because just for reasons like that, and especially with the explosion of AI, you cannot build a model on data that is just limited to just that one cohort. That's where the explosion of data and the ability to transfer, share, collaborate, on a global scale, or at least minimum like a regional scale versus maybe your niche, set of pediatric patients in this, zip code +4, you have like just the opportunities have exploded a ton, and it can be secured. So you want to talk about it more so that people lean into it instead of picturing it as like, oh, that can't apply to us. Sure, it can. You can do it, and you should be. Because if not, you're just chasing, and then you're still building on 10 records of Donald Duck, and your buy-in curve is just so much, so much longer.
Again, having done that, the management of that data, keeping it clean, but there's also that element of, you talked about the scale of the data, but sometimes just one variation. Sometimes it could be the social security number starts with a 7, and the whole thing can break. So that's
Yeah.
where the scale of data and having a wide variety of it out there. So is that a part of those kind of creating synthetic data, making sure that you've got a variation within a certain parameters? Because like social security number,
Yeah.
there's a very well defined format for that, but the
Yeah.
variations are not infinite, obviously, but very, very wide in that.
And I mean, my best answer to that is kind of like, to me, that's why entire companies exist that just have proven how to synthesize data, because the ability, like 1 million records, just anonymized to become 1 million records, like the volume count is only the same. When you really want to build a model or test an algorithm, and it's synthetic, it's got to be, you're getting into like statistical type of jargon that is a little bit beyond
sure.
me. So, let me kind of phone a friend on that, but that's where you're at. Of like, you have so many different, levers you can pull of what makes sense. Can I just protect the data and my dev team, is clean? Do I need to anonymize? At least it is my data, but I've kind of masked it, or, removed all PHI. Or, if I am going to just, model something that is, in the clinical world, or a genomic set, things like that, like, how do I make sure that the synthetic data that I am using is statistically significant? So there's a ton of those tiers, and again, it's just that's kind of why there's such a pop-up of teams, companies that either audit, prove, or even build to say, hey, we will build a synthetic set off of your data and prove to you why it's completely de-identified and synthetic. But now you could use that for a model, or whatever you need to do with it. If you're monetizing it, giving it to a dev team, et cetera. But there's just so much more that you can do today than when I was, fingers on keyboards kind of drawing these. I mean, even this explosion of concepts of data clean rooms to, like me to share data to you, Brian, it used to just be, maybe a safe harbor rule, or, we'd have a BAA and we could say, hey, here's what we're agreeing to send. And if we align to that scope, I share it to you. But sometimes you get a wake up call of, hey, if we don't know what either of us has, and we're just kind of curious, from your buying pattern to my maybe, patient population, if I have 1 million patients and I send it to you and I go, hey, we think that we're lined up at like a 50% overlap here, this could get really exciting. And next thing you know, we both send a file, and like, guess what? It's only a 4% overlap. Well, like we might walk away because now it's not either significant, or the cohort isn't accurate enough, or it's just not going to generate rev. And so I want to maybe then start shifting to you or to a different partner. I mean, that's a pretty big matzo ball staring at you when I know that I'm protected with an NDA and a BUA, a BAA, or a DUA, whatever it is. But the fact is, I may have just given you a million patient records, and I have to trust that you're not going to do anything with it. Now you have concepts of, like, say, data clean rooms, where it's like a double blind join, to where, hey, let's join on what we agree is a key, and only where it overlaps is data exposed. And it doesn't even mean that then that whole record is exposed. It just means like, hey, where we match, maybe we just give a count. And then we go, hey, there was enough meat here. Let's go deeper. Now I give a count plus like a zip +4, or I give like a clinical cohort or an age bracket, and you can keep going. And so, whether that, originated in the media sector and has now been applied into healthcare, that is how you have opportunities now to figure out, how do I find better, people, and not necessarily patients, for drug studies and without having to give away an entire book of business first. I can just kind of, you build a clean room to say, hey, let's figure out where we overlay and then allow the release of more and more info as we both agree. So those kind of innovations of where you can have much more, strategic data protection rather than legal data protection is also incredibly rewarding, but also just innovative. It just opens up so much more when you know that like you can prove something before just you lean on a legal document. Be like, hey, don't forget, Brian, I just gave you 1 million of my members. But it's not going to work. So we walk away. It's tough, and that's because you get demonstration data sets, and in the end, when those say demonstrations expire, what do? You get an email from somebody who goes, hey, I need you to sign off on this, that you've destroyed the data. I mean, most organizations are probably like, shoot, I don't even know where I put that data. That was a year ago. So
Or it's
now,
like
like,
in their backups too. So yeah.
exactly. So to be able to have full lineage on where you get things and make sure that, you share with intent, and then you can revoke, not just stop sharing, that's where we're at. I mean, in the world of data security, of like the stories I lean on that I smile is I could produce you a report, but I don't know what you do with it after that point. If you put it on an Excel spreadsheet and you create the pivot table, that solves, whatever your problem is, I mean, you wouldn't like, there's a lot of naivety that's not a security breach with intent, but you're like, oh, I hid the data tab. Well, Brian, I can already tell by your skill set, you could be like, hey, unhide tab, and oh, there's all the master data. Next thing you know, you see everything that drove, even though the user is like, well, all I did is give him the summary of his claim volume or his patient count, so like there's a lot of ways that like in the world of data security and data strategy, organizations have to sort of protect their people from themselves, because you just sometimes don't know. And that is the risk of, again, I've been at Snowflake for a long time, but like that's kind of why we lean a lot on like the risk of moving and copying data. Like every time you do it, you don't know what the other party is doing with it once they get it. So if I can bring you or bring your application to the data, I have a much more controlled and, sort of, compliant friendly way of being able to revoke it super quick and things like that.
Yeah, I think the principles that you've talked about are definitely like privacy by design in practice, where I like what you said about the differentiator between, you know, the legal versus strategic approach, which is really saying like instead of meeting the bare minimum and meeting those contractual obligations that we have, we're going beyond that because we're thinking through like, what is the practical use case and how can we actually minimize data that our team members are seeing, and that
Yeah.
how can we actually bring that compliance requirement to life. So I think that's a really awesome innovation to hear. And I think there's definitely so many use cases of that because most companies are terrible at the principle of least privilege. So it's
In,
nice
in
to hear
your
about.
in your whole history of working with anybody as a business partner, have they ever not asked you for every data element that you may have possible? You guys are
Yeah,
both
for sure.
nodding if we're not on video. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the nature. Like if you have 100 data elements and you're still asking for 100 data elements, and then guess what? If you are only using 8 of them, those other 92 are they necessary? They're probably not. So I like where you smiled there and lean and I re-smiled back. That is the difference of like Hippo when I was, a young whippersnapper and very eager. I just thought, hey, I removed your name, I removed your SSN, I removed your date of birth. I'm good. Well, not at all. Like there is minimum necessary is a pretty loaded statement. And if I overshare because I'm just like, hey, I used this template for my last customer, like why not just use the same template? It just doesn't work like that. You need to design and be flexible enough to have a data platform, a strategy, et cetera, that says, hey, I will adhere to privacy protection and minimum necessary at all costs. So
Yeah, I think that's awesome to hear. Just it's great to hear it in practice. But yeah, that's like an industry shift, right? Most of us are used to organizations that want all of our data.
oh
And
yeah,
so
everybody asks. And you should. I mean, you should ask because because you're like, oh, I never know when I'll need it. But there's also no harm. You can always add more. I mean, like once you share those 100, I mean, good luck trying to reel it back and like take 10 off. And so there's a lot of those things that just make it easy. And that's kind of where when you get into cloud-based sharing and whatnot, it's like I can be much more dynamic and intention. I can see lineage of like, hey, you're not using all this. So maybe I don't need to share it at the cadence that I normally share, like the core file, or, because again, the deeper the audit goes, Brian, you led with the question. You just don't want to get exposed. So if I can stay ahead of it, playing offense rather than constantly playing defense and chasing, you're in a better spot.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts kind of on the data strategy before I kind of pivot to our last question?
I mean, the last one in healthcare is no different than the other industries in this regard. But I mean, there's just such an explosion of unstructured data now, like, protecting structured data. And by that, it's an audience, like transactional data that comes and it's, rows and columns, and it's easy to use and look at. That is what most people, when they talk data, think of. But you are now in, just you blink an eye and this AI effect, PDFs, documents, Word docs, audio files, video, DICOM images, your lab work. All those things used to kind of be, hey, this is on a different burner. This team deals with that, and they'll give you an insight and share it back. Now, like those are fair game. You can upload those to a, chat GPT and tell me, hey, what do you notice in this contract? Like, so I think that is also the fun of, you guys having a forum like this, because like security and protection of unstructured data is like, pour a second cup of coffee. That is totally different than once you become structured. And so that's kind of why you have so many layers of data to figure out how does it all come together. Because if I need to protect a 200-page document now, not just, Brian's medical record or his structured data entry, it's a different kettle of fish. So you have to be savvy enough to know how to protect semi-structured, unstructured, and traditional data all in one fell swoop, and to make sure that it doesn't get circumvented with, BI or AI. So that's probably the last piece. Then in healthcare, it's just even more volatile, because you are constantly getting flooded with more and more different pieces to chase a care, in a clinical encounter scenario.
Yeah, and then unstructured data in a healthcare context means your X-ray images, your
Yep, you got it.
images from an MRI machine. Like, you want to talk about the most intimate data. Let's talk about your literal insides.
Yes, sir. You got it.
And in that case, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And those are the types of images that some really crazy stuff with AI is happening around, which means, we're trying to shove as much imagery into that. Gather up all of that unstructured data to get all those different insights to say, this person, I think, has cancer. It doesn't show up very well on the image, so you might not see it, but go look here.
Yeah.
And that kind of insight is amazing for a doctor. It's also amazing for a threat actor that wants to take advantage of it.
You got it. I mean, ambient listening is one of the most applicable AI valuable use cases, and you don't always know when it's happening, but guess what?
Yeah.
So that protection of, just think about how much we just shared on a podcast here. If that is a clinical conversation, anyway, you can draw the lines, but that's probably of why, data security never goes away. Data governance never goes away, because the minute you even think you have it contained, there's a new format, there's a new volume, there's, now I have to protect our audio files. Holy smokes. So anyway, it's kind of, it keeps us, excited, when you're in it, when you're one of the data nerds.
Well, I'll be curious to hear your response to this. Definitely, given we've definitely talked about data minimization and some privacy tactics that are really important to the healthcare specific industry. So a couple of years ago, I had a CTO tell me that he felt like the fight for privacy was dead, and now it was really only the fight for security. I would love to just hear your response to that.
Wow, is he still, sorry, the joke, is he still employed?
We have had a guest in the recent past, want to have words. I'll say the calm version of it, have words with that CTO. So
no, it's good. It's good. Honestly, sometimes you need to say things like that to find out if your team reacts in the way that you would want a reaction. But I mean, the smile, or to give you a real answer, is, I mean, you cannot have one without the other. I mean, in healthcare, data privacy, data security, I mean, they're imperative. They're critically important. But you can't, and to be honest, you can't have. So even though clearly by my reaction, I would say data privacy is almost even more important, you can't actually have data privacy without data security. But security alone is not enough to, guarantee, that privacy is being honored. Like you can have security, to lock the door, but the privacy of like, who gets a key, and then even once you get the key, what are you allowed to do once you're inside? That's what we're talking about. And I think my smile on that as a person who's been in healthcare is, and again, like I think about it as like, hey, if I got past, like the first line of defense and I saw your entire data, shopping cart catalog, that's one thing. But if I get in and I see everything about you, Brian, from, birth to now, I mean, that is a totally different, like there's a reason it's called, the reason HEP exists and different, controls and mandates. So, I mean, it's kind of like in the mantras, that we live by. It's know where your data is, protect your data. How do you unlock your data? And with that, those come different needs. But to maybe come back around, like why privacy matters so much is I need to know that the best care that's delivered is when you trust your doctor and you trust the system that they have. I trust that the ambient listener you have that is an AI bot is going to work and actually help my care. If I don't, I won't walk in the room. So, getting into the room like matters. And like that's kind of like a little TED talk, like snippet I say all the time is, a person, whether that's a patient or just a general person, they build more trust and confidence when they only have to tell their story once. If I walk into 10 doctors to deal with, like in a whole episode of care, or especially as a guardian of my daughter, there's nothing worse than having to kind of like retell all your stories. So my point there is the ability that everybody wants to be treated with their care differently according to how they, will best adhere. I'm very face to face. My wife loves digital. I mean, she would rather just chat or, take a telehead, and or telemed. Sorry about that. I want to actually like engage with the person. So, that is where privacy shines way over, security. And so I think healthcare as an industry, probably we resonate with privacy way more than maybe any other industry. So that's probably my sort of my visceral reaction. But anyway, so my answer to that is no. I think I would hope that gentleman or woman was using that line to try to get a reaction to figure out, hey, because if your organization only looks at it one way or the other, you are going to probably have some exposure. And that's something on your risk register. The intersection of privacy and security is where you have, value delivered at the point of care and with enough that that they're going to come back because they've seen that you trust and, you augment. It's no different than like when somebody signs off something, and like, hey, we'll never sell your data. You might go to the ACL festival and like you signed up. Next thing you know, you get like, how'd you know I was there? You clearly didn't. Guess what? I mean, you remember that. That is the difference of privacy and security. And you can just see, like, so, imagine if it's a clinical record or, hey, you just found out something about my care. So anyway, I'm probably beating the horse on that, but the smile is, you can't have one without the other. And, depending on what day of the week you ask me, I would probably lean, one versus the other is more priority. But in healthcare, privacy is it's at its core. So, and again, that's the fun of why data strategies and data usage never go away. Like there is never been one system that has lasted forever because you always have to be able to adjust. And with the world of AI, privacy matters even more because I can't circumvent AI because an LLMs, can tell me what Brian did because something got uploaded. That's why. So anyway, I love the question. Kind of funny on the reaction that it gets because that's what it's supposed to do. So I'm gonna probably
Yeah,
use
absolutely.
I'm gonna use that with my own team and just see what they say. Because if they don't react, I'll be like, okay, let's go talk.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love that insight. Well, Patrick, this has been great. Really appreciate you joining us, giving us your time. I think we've got the opportunity to bring you on and talk more because I feel like we didn't even even
Yeah.
really crack the nut at this
Anytime.
point.
Anytime.
Cool.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. Take care. And that was a great conversation with Patrick. Obviously, a lot of deep knowledge, a lot of really thoughtful time spent with customers. And of course, as I mentioned at the opening, Patrick has had himself. So he's been there. He knows what it's like. I do a lot with healthcare as well in my day-to-day job. Over the years, I've also worked at a health insurance provider. So obviously a topic I found very near and dear. And I loved, he really highlighted the fact that, defending and protecting data within a healthcare environment really is one of the most important things that they can be doing. I will oftentimes say it's number 2 to actually providing healthcare. But when you're in those more payer environments like health insurance, it definitely should be job number 1. I think I've stated it on this podcast multiple times from that perspective. It is just high quality data, which means that it is ripe for attack. It is ripe for, things like double extortions and whatnot. And Patrick nailed it when he said that, we have to remember that we are always talking about a human being. There's data, and we're dealing with all this data and individual pieces of data, but when it comes down to it, all those individual data points all point back to an actual human. And if we don't take that into consideration, if those of us that work with healthcare or deal with healthcare related data don't keep that in mind, we're really missing the point of all this. Data is awesome. Data can do some amazing things and can teach us really interesting things and help us to find cancer and to do these things. But as we feed it into the machine, as we share it with other business entities, we got to make sure that we remember that there is a human attached to that. And, that really kind of comes into play when we start talking AI and how we can protect that data. The fact that if I feed a bunch of data from a healthcare environment into AI and tell it to give me some insights into it, if I don't have, or if I'm able to access data that I normally shouldn't, that's a major issue. So, we're all careening very quickly with AI. But it's super important to be able to make sure that the permissions of any given piece of data are translated all the way through the AI to make sure that anybody accessing that model and asking it questions is able to only get access to what they would if they were going and doing it manually. So a lot of really great insights. I really love that conversation with Patrick and really hope we'll be able to get him on again sometime. But for now, we really appreciate you listening to this. We hope you found it very useful and you were able to learn along with us. We'd love to hear from you. So hit us up at info@socializingsecurity.com, and we'd love to hear what you thought about this conversation, all the others we've had, and any others that you would like to have. We would really value that feedback. So we'll talk to you again next week. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.